In 1584, the most feared ruler of medieval Russia, Ivan IV, remembered as the Terrible, died surrounded by silence and suspicion. Behind him, he left a family line scarred by death, exile, and rumor. 8 children were born to the Tsar. Only one would sit on the throne, and with him, the centuries-old dynasty of Rurik would vanish. The Kremlin walls had witnessed births that promised golden ages and deaths that shattered dynasties. Each infant born to Ivan carried the weight of an empire stretching from the Baltic to the Caspian Sea. Yet by 1598, 14 years after Ivan's own death, not one of his children would remain alive to continue the bloodline that had ruled Russia for over 7 centuries. Today we trace what became of each son and daughter, from the infants who never left the Kremlin nursery to the crowned heir whose reign ended in age. We follow their paths through palace corridors and monastery cells, through coronation ceremonies and murder investigations, through the rise and fall of the last Rurikid dynasty. This is the true story of Ivan the Terrible's children, their births, their lives, their fates, and the dynasty that died with them. Before we begin this journey through the halls of the Kremlin and into the forgotten corners of Russian history, take a moment to subscribe if you haven't already. These stories of lost dynasties and forgotten heirs don't tell themselves, and I'm curious, where in the world are you watching from? And what time is it as you settle in for this tale? Drop a comment below. There's something fascinating about how these centuries-old stories reach us across both distance and time. Now let us step back to 1549, when hope still lived in the royal nurseries of Moscow. The year 1549 marked a turning point in Ivan IV's reign. At 19, the young Tsar had consolidated power, survived a devastating fire in Moscow, and married Anastasia Romanovna, a union that would define his early years as a ruler. When Anastasia gave birth to their first child in the summer of 1549, the Kremlin celebrated the arrival of Anna Ivanovna. Anna's birth represented more than personal joy for Ivan and Anastasia. It signaled the continuation of the Rurikid line, a dynasty that traced its origins to the legendary Viking prince Rurik in the 9th century. The infant princess was placed under the care of experienced wet nurses and surrounded by the elaborate rituals of Orthodox Christianity that governed royal births. Yet Anna Ivanovna would never see her first birthday. Historical records from the period are sparse, but chronicles indicate that the princess died in infancy, likely before the winter of 1549 had ended. Her death, while tragic, was not unusual in an era when infant mortality claimed the lives of princes and peasants alike. Medical knowledge remained primitive, and even the wealth and power of the Kremlin could not protect against the diseases that swept through 16th century Moscow. Anna was buried in the Cathedral of the Archangel within the Kremlin walls, though her grave marker has not survived the centuries. Her brief life served as a harbinger of the mortality that would plague Ivan's lineage throughout the decades to come. Approximately 2 years after Anna's death, Anastasia bore Ivan another daughter. Maria Ivanovna entered the world during a period of relative stability in the Russian court. Ivan's reforms were taking hold, the boyar councils were functioning with less conflict, and the young Tsar appeared to be maturing into an effective ruler. Like her older sister, Maria was raised within the protected environment of the women's quarters, or harem, of the Kremlin palace. Orthodox tradition dictated that royal daughters receive education in religious matters, reading, and the domestic skills befitting their station. The curriculum included Church Slavonic literacy, knowledge of scripture, and training in the ceremonial roles expected of Russian princesses. Maria's upbringing was supervised by carefully selected boyar families, particularly those connected to the Romanov clan through her mother Anastasia. These early years of Ivan's reign were marked by the influence of moderate advisors like the priest Sylvester and the boyar Alexei Adashev, men who advocated for measured governance and orthodox piety. Yet Maria Ivanovna, like her sister before her, would not survive childhood. Historical sources suggest she died around 1552 or 1553, still an infant. The exact cause of her death remains unknown, but contemporary medical practices offered little protection against the epidemic diseases that periodically ravaged Moscow. Her burial took place in the same cathedral of the Archangel where Anna had been laid to rest. The loss of two daughters in succession weighed heavily on Ivan and Anastasia, creating an atmosphere of anxiety around questions of succession that would intensify with each subsequent birth and death in the royal family. The deaths of Anna and Maria established a pattern that would haunt Ivan's reign. The fragility of royal children in an age when medicine could not match the ambitions of empire. These early losses also marked the beginning of Ivan's complex relationship with mortality, divine will, and the responsibilities of kingship that would shape his increasingly erratic behavior in later years. In October 1552, as Ivan IV celebrated his conquest of Kazan and the expansion of Russian territory into the Volga region, Anastasia delivered the news the empire had been waiting for: a male heir. Dmitry Ivanovich was born into a Russia transformed by military victory and territorial expansion. The timing seemed providential, a son born in the year of Ivan's greatest triumph. The birth of a tsarevich carried immense political significance. Unlike his sisters, Dmitry would inherit not just wealth and status, but the sacred responsibility of ruling an Orthodox empire. His arrival prompted elaborate ceremonies in the Cathedral of the Assumption, where Orthodox priests conducted the special blessing reserved for imperial heirs. Ivan immediately began planning for his son's future. The infant was granted the formal title of Tsarevich, marking him as the designated heir to the Russian throne. Court scribes recorded his birth in the official chronicles, while diplomats prepared announcements for foreign courts. The Kremlin's atmosphere shifted from the quiet mourning that had followed the deaths of Anna and Maria to celebration and renewed dynastic confidence. In the spring of 1553, Ivan made a decision that would prove fateful. Seeking to give thanks for his military victories and to pray for his son's health, the Tsar organized a pilgrimage to the Trinity Monastery of St. Sergius, located approximately 70 kilometers northeast of Moscow. This monastery held special significance as the spiritual center of Russian Orthodoxy and a site where previous rulers had sought divine blessing. The royal entourage that departed Moscow in late spring included not only Ivan and Anastasia, but also the infant Dmitry and a substantial court retinue. The journey required several days of travel through the Russian countryside, with overnight stops at designated waypoints. For a 6-month-old infant, such travel presented significant challenges in an era before modern transportation or medical care. Contemporary accounts suggest that Dmitry fell ill during the pilgrimage, though the exact nature of his sickness remains unclear. Some chronicles mention fever, while others refer to weakness and failure to feed properly. What is certain is that the infant's condition deteriorated rapidly once the symptoms appeared. Dmitry Ivanovich died in May 1553, still an infant of less than 8 months. His death occurred either during the pilgrimage itself or shortly after the royal family's return to Moscow. The loss devastated Ivan and Anastasia, representing not just personal grief but a major political crisis for the young dynasty. The death of the heir apparent immediately raised questions about succession. Ivan had no other legitimate male children, and Russian law did not provide for female inheritance of the throne. The boyar councils began subtle discussions about potential alternatives, including Ivan's younger brother Yuri, though such conversations remained carefully hidden from the increasingly volatile Tsar. Dmitry was buried in the Cathedral of the Archangel with full honors befitting a Tsarevich. His tomb was marked with an inscription identifying him as the first son of Ivan IV, though the marker would later be overshadowed by the more elaborate monuments erected for his younger brothers. The death of the first Dmitry had lasting implications for Ivan's reign and personality. The loss occurred during a period when the Tsar was already beginning to show signs of the paranoia and rage that would characterize his later years. Some historians argue that Dmitry's death contributed to Ivan's growing distrust of the boyar nobility, whom he blamed for various misfortunes befalling his family. The succession crisis also strengthened the position of Ivan's advisors, particularly Alexei Adashev and the priest Sylvester, who counseled patience and reliance on divine providence. Their influence would continue for several more years, though Ivan's confidence in their guidance was beginning to waver. The death of the first Tsarevich established a precedent of royal infant mortality that would plague Ivan's lineage throughout his reign. It also marked the beginning of Ivan's complex relationship with pilgrimage and religious observance, as he struggled to understand why divine favor had been withdrawn from his family, despite his military victories and pious observances. In March 1554, less than a year after the death of the first Dmitri, Anastasia gave birth to another son. Named Ivan after his father, the new tsarevich arrived during a period of continued military success and administrative reform. The court, still mourning the loss of the previous heir, greeted this birth with cautious optimism and elaborate protective rituals designed to ensure the infant's survival. Ivan Ivanovich's birth was recorded with particular care in the court chronicles. Unlike his deceased brother, this child would survive infancy and grow to become the most prominent of Ivan IV's children. His early years were marked by exceptional attention to his health, education, and preparation for eventual rule. The young tsarevich was placed under the guardianship of carefully selected boyars and clerics. His wet nurses were chosen from families with proven loyalty to the crown, while his early education was supervised by learned monks from the Trinity Monastery. Ivan IV, determined not to lose another heir, personally oversaw many aspects of his son's upbringing. As Ivan Ivanovich grew from childhood to adolescence, his education expanded beyond the basic religious instruction given to all royal children. He studied Church Slavonic and Greek, learned the fundamentals of Orthodox theology, and received training in military arts appropriate to his future role as commander of Russian armies. The curriculum designed for the tsarevich reflected the broader cultural developments of Ivan IV's reign. This was a period when Russian intellectuals were engaging more deeply with Byzantine traditions while also absorbing influences from Western Europe. Young Ivan learned about statecraft through direct observation of his father's court, attending council meetings and ceremonial functions from an early age. His military education began formally around age 10, when he was assigned tutors experienced in cavalry tactics and siege warfare. The boy showed aptitude for both academic studies and martial skills, leading courtiers to predict a reign that would combine his father's military prowess with greater intellectual sophistication. As he entered his teenage years, Ivan Ivanovich began participating in actual military campaigns. He accompanied his father to the ongoing siege of Polotsk in 1563, where he observed siege tactics and gained first-hand experience of warfare. These campaigns served as practical education in the realities of ruling a militaristic state. In 1571, at age 17, Ivan Ivanovich married Eudoxia Saburova, a member of a prominent boyar family. The marriage was arranged to strengthen ties between the crown and the nobility during a period of increasing political tension. The wedding ceremony, held in the Cathedral of the Assumption, followed traditional Orthodox rites with the added pageantry befitting the heir to the throne. The marriage initially appeared successful, producing hopes for a new generation of Rurikid heirs. However, within 2 years, the union was dissolved under circumstances that remain historically unclear. Some sources suggest that Eudoxia was accused of witchcraft, a common charge leveled against women who failed to produce children quickly. Others indicate political pressure from boyar factions opposed to the Saburo family's influence. Following the annulment, Eudoxia was forced to take monastic vows and was confined to a convent, effectively removing her from political life. This treatment reflected the harsh realities facing women in the Russian court who fell from favor, whether through personal failings or political calculations. In 1575, Ivan Ivanovich married again, this time to Praskovia Solovaya, daughter of a minor court official. This second marriage was less politically significant but appeared more personally compatible. Praskovia adapted well to court life and maintained good relations with Ivan IV, who had grown increasingly difficult to please as his own mental state deteriorated. As Ivan Ivanovich matured, he began taking on significant governmental responsibilities. His father, now deep into the Oprichnina period of terror and persecution, relied increasingly on his son to handle diplomatic correspondence and military planning. The tsarevich demonstrated competence in these roles, earning respect from foreign ambassadors and military commanders. During the Livonian War, which consumed much of Ivan IV's later reign, the tsarevich played an active role in strategic planning and field command. He led Russian forces in several engagements, showing tactical skill and personal courage. His performance in these campaigns enhanced his reputation among the nobility and military leadership, many of whom began to see him as a more stable alternative to his increasingly erratic father. Ivan Ivanovich also served as a moderating influence on his father's more extreme policies. Contemporary accounts describe instances where the Tsarevich interceded on behalf of boyars facing execution or exile during the Oprichnina persecutions. While he could not openly oppose his father's policies, he quietly worked to limit their most destructive effects. His involvement in governance extended to diplomatic relations with the European powers. The Tsarevich conducted negotiations with Polish and Swedish representatives, demonstrating sophisticated understanding of international politics. Foreign observers noted his intelligence and pragmatic approach to problem-solving, qualities that contrasted favorably with his father's increasing unpredictability. The event that ended Ivan Ivanovich's life occurred in November 1581 during a heated argument with his father in the Kremlin palace. The exact details of this confrontation remain disputed by historians, but the basic facts are established by multiple contemporary sources. The argument apparently began over military strategy concerning the ongoing Livonian War. Russia had been engaged in this conflict for over 20 years, draining the treasury and exhausting the population. Ivan Ivanovich had reportedly advocated for a more aggressive military approach, possibly including personal leadership of a new campaign against Polish forces. Ivan IV, by this time 51 years old and showing signs of mental instability, reacted violently to his son's suggestions. Contemporary accounts describe the Tsar striking his son with an iron-pointed staff, the same weapon he used as a walking stick and symbol of authority. The blow to Ivan Ivanovich's head proved fatal, though he lingered for several days before dying from his injuries. During these final days, Ivan Wolf reportedly showed extreme remorse, refusing to leave his son's bedside and calling for prayers and medical treatment that proved ineffective. Ivan Ivanovich died on November 19, 1581, at age 27. His death removed the most capable heir to the Russian throne and left the succession in the hands of his younger brother Fyodor, who was widely regarded as unfit for the demands of ruling a vast empire. The immediate aftermath of the Tsarevich's death saw unprecedented displays of grief from Ivan IV. Court observers reported that the Tsar tore his hair, beat his chest, and called for his own death as punishment for the act. This extreme reaction was followed by periods of depression and religious obsession that further impaired Ivan's ability to govern effectively. The death was officially recorded as accidental, though rumors of patricide spread throughout Russia and reached foreign courts. These stories, whether true or exaggerated, contributed to Ivan IV's reputation for uncontrolled violence and mental instability. Ivan Ivanovich was buried in the Cathedral of the Archangel with elaborate ceremonies befitting an heir to the throne. His tomb was marked with inscriptions praising his piety, learning, and military service. The monument became a site of pilgrimage for Russians who viewed the Tsarevich as a victim of his father's tyranny. The death of Ivan Ivanovich created a succession crisis that would ultimately lead to the end of the Rurikid dynasty. With the capable heir gone, the throne would pass to Fyodor, whose gentle nature and apparent intellectual limitations made him unsuitable for the complex challenges facing Russia. The Tsarevich's death also marked the beginning of the end for Ivan IV's effective rule. The remaining 3 years of the Tsar's reign were characterized by increasing isolation, religious obsession, and administrative chaos. The vigor and strategic thinking that had marked Ivan's early conquests gave way to erratic decision-making and political persecution. Historical assessments of Ivan Ivanovich consistently portray him as the most promising of Ivan IV's children. His education, military experience, and demonstrated competence in governance suggested that he might have provided the stable leadership Russia needed to consolidate the gains of his father's reign while avoiding the excesses of the Oprichnina period. The tragic irony of his death, killed by the father whose throne he was destined to inherit, has made Ivan Ivanovich a symbol of wasted potential in Russian history. His story illustrates the destructive effects of absolute power when combined with mental instability, and the vulnerability of even the most privileged individuals to sudden violence in an autocratic system. In 1556, as Ivan IV's relationship with his advisors Adashev and Sylvester began to deteriorate, Anastasia gave birth to another daughter. Eudoxia Ivanovna entered the world during a period of mounting tension in the Russian court as the Tsar's early reforms gave way to increasingly autocratic rule. The birth of another daughter, while welcomed, could not address the fundamental succession anxieties that plagued the royal family. With only one surviving son, Ivan Ivanovich, the dynasty remained vulnerable to the infant mortality that had already claimed 3 of Ivan's children. Eudoxia's birth was recorded in the court chronicles with the standard ceremonial language reserved for royal children, but the celebration was more subdued than those marking the births of potential male heirs. The court's attention remained focused primarily on the health and education of her older brother, Ivan Ivanovich. Like her deceased sisters, Eudoxia was raised in the women's quarters of the Kremlin palace under the supervision of carefully selected noble families. The harem provided a protected environment where royal daughters received education appropriate to their status, while being shielded from the political intrigues that increasingly consumed the male members of the court. Her upbringing followed the traditional pattern established for Russian princesses: instruction in Orthodox theology, Church Slavonic literacy, and the domestic skills expected of noble women. The curriculum also included training in court etiquette and ceremonial roles, preparing her for potential marriage alliances that could strengthen the dynasty's political position. Eudoxia's early years coincided with a period of growing strain in her parents' marriage. Anastasia's health was beginning to decline, possibly due to the repeated pregnancies and the stress of court life during Ivan's increasingly erratic rule. The Tsarina's illness cast a shadow over the royal household and may have affected the attention given to the youngest princess. During Eudoxia's infancy, her mother Anastasia began showing signs of the illness that would eventually claim her life. Contemporary accounts describe symptoms consistent with a wasting disease, possibly cancer, or another chronic condition for which 16th century medicine had no effective treatment. Anastasia's deteriorating health created additional anxiety within the royal family. As Ivan's first wife and the mother of his heir, she played a crucial stabilizing role in the court. Her illness removed this moderating influence at a time when Ivan was already showing signs of the paranoia and violence that would characterize his later reign. The Tsarina's condition also affected the care and attention given to young Eudoxia. With Anastasia increasingly confined to her chambers and Ivan preoccupied with political and military affairs, the princess relied more heavily on her assigned guardians and wet nurses for daily care. Eudoxia Ivanovna died in 1558 at approximately 2 years of age. The exact cause of her death is not recorded in surviving historical documents, but it occurred during the same period when her mother's health was rapidly declining. Some historians speculate that both mother and daughter may have succumbed to the same illness, though this remains unconfirmed. The princess's death added to the mounting tragedies that would define Ivan's family life. Coming so soon after the deaths of Anna, Maria, and the first Dmitri, Eudoxia's passing reinforced the pattern of infant mortality that plagued the royal household. Her death was particularly devastating for Anastasia, who was already weakened by illness. The loss of another daughter, combined with her own failing health, may have accelerated the Tsarina's decline. Contemporary accounts describe Anastasia as becoming increasingly withdrawn and spending long hours in prayer following Eudoxia's death. Eudoxia was buried in the Cathedral of the Archangel alongside her siblings. Her tomb, like those of Anna and Maria, was marked with a simple inscription identifying her as a daughter of Ivan IV and Anastasia. The repeated burials of royal children in the cathedral served as a stark reminder of the dynasty's vulnerability to the medical limitations of the era. The loss of Eudoxia marked the end of Anastasia's childbearing years. The Tsarina's failing health made further pregnancies impossible, leaving Ivan with only one surviving child from his first marriage, the Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich. Eudoxia's death occurred during the final phase of Anastasia's life, as the Tsarina struggled with illness while trying to maintain her role as Ivan's primary advisor and emotional anchor. The loss of 4 children had taken a severe psychological toll on both parents, but Anastasia bore the additional burden of repeated pregnancies and the social pressure to produce multiple male heirs. The princess's death also coincided with Ivan's growing suspicion of the boyar nobility, whom he increasingly blamed for his family's misfortunes. While there is no evidence that Eudoxia's death was anything other than natural, It occurred during a period when Ivan was becoming convinced that enemies at court were using poison and witchcraft against his family. While Eudoxia Ivanovna's life was brief, her death contributed to the psychological transformation of Ivan IV from a reforming czar into the paranoid autocrat remembered by history. The accumulation of family tragedies, combined with political pressures and military setbacks, gradually eroded Ivan's mental stability and capacity for rational governance. Her death also marked another step toward the eventual extinction of the Rurikid line. With 4 of Ivan's children already dead and only Ivan Ivanovich surviving from his first marriage, the dynasty's continuation depended increasingly on the health and future offspring of a single heir. The brief life and early death of Eudoxia Ivanovna thus represents more than personal tragedy. It illustrates the vulnerability of royal dynasties to the medical realities of the 16th century and the psychological pressures that shaped the character of one of Russia's most notorious rulers. In May 1557, Anastasia gave birth to her final child, a son who would be named Fyodor. His arrival brought cautious joy to a royal household already marked by repeated tragedy. Unlike his deceased siblings, Fyodor would survive infancy and eventually inherit the throne of Russia, though his reign would prove to be the final chapter in the 7th century rule of the Rurikid dynasty. Fyodor's birth occurred during a pivotal period in Ivan IV's reign. The Tsar was beginning to distance himself from his moderate advisors while developing the increasingly autocratic tendencies that would define his later years. Anastasia's health was already showing signs of the decline that would claim her life 3 years later, making Fyodor's survival particularly precious to his parents. From his earliest years, it was apparent that Fyodor differed significantly from his older brother Ivan Ivanovich. While the elder prince showed intelligence, ambition, and military aptitude, Fyodor displayed a gentle, contemplative nature more suited to monastic life than imperial rule. Contemporary observers noted his piety, his love of religious ceremony, and his apparent lack of interest in the political and military affairs that consumed his father and brother. As Fyodor grew from childhood to adolescence, his distinctive personality became increasingly evident to the court. Unlike the typical Rurikid princes who were expected to demonstrate martial valor and political cunning, Fyodor showed greater interest in religious observance and charitable works. He spent long hours in prayer, demonstrated deep knowledge of Orthodox theology, and preferred the company of monks and priests to that of soldiers and courtiers. This religious orientation was not necessarily viewed as weakness in medieval Russia, where piety was highly valued among rulers. However, Fyodor's gentle nature was accompanied by what contemporary sources describe as intellectual limitations. While not entirely incapable, he appeared to lack the strategic thinking and forceful personality traditionally associated with effective czars. Court observers noted that Fyodor seemed more comfortable following established routines than making independent decisions. He memorized religious texts with impressive accuracy, but struggled with the complex political calculations required for governing a vast empire. His tutors found him dutiful but unimaginative, capable of learning prescribed lessons but unable to apply that knowledge creatively to new situations. Despite concerns about his capabilities, Fyodor received the full education expected of a potential heir to the throne. His curriculum included instruction in Church Slavonic and Greek, study of Byzantine law and precedent, and basic training in military affairs. However, his tutors quickly learned to adapt their teaching methods to accommodate his particular learning style and interests. Religious instruction formed the core of Fyodor's education. He demonstrated genuine aptitude for theological study and showed particular interest in the lives of saints and the traditions of Orthodox monasticism. This focus aligned with his natural inclinations but may have come at the expense of more practical training in statecraft and military command. His military education proved largely unsuccessful. While Fyodor learned the basic requirements of cavalry riding and weapons handling, he showed no enthusiasm for warfare and appeared uncomfortable with the violence inherent in military campaigns. Instructors noted that he seemed distressed by descriptions of battle tactics and preferred to discuss the moral implications of war rather than its strategic applications. As he entered his teenage years, Fyodor began participating in court ceremonies and state functions. He performed these duties competently, but without the charisma or commanding presence that characterized successful rulers. Foreign ambassadors who met him during this period described a polite, well-meaning young man who seemed overwhelmed by the grandeur of his position. In 1580, at age 23, Fyodor married Irina Godunova, sister of Boris Godunov, who would later become one of the most powerful figures in Russian politics. The marriage was arranged by Ivan IV as part of his efforts to secure alliances with prominent boyar families during the final years of his reign. The choice of Irina Godunova as Fyodor's bride reflected careful political calculation. The Godunov family had risen to prominence through loyal service to the crown and represented a potential source of competent advisors for the future tsar. Boris Godunov in particular had demonstrated exceptional administrative and military skills that could compensate for Fyodor's limitations. The wedding ceremony, held in the Cathedral of the Assumption, followed traditional Orthodox rites with the elaborate pageantry befitting the heir to the throne. Contemporary accounts describe Fyodor as nervous but dutiful during the proceedings, while Irina appeared composed and confident in her new role as future Tsarina. The marriage proved personally compatible, with both spouses sharing deep religious convictions and preference for quiet domestic life over court intrigue. However, the union's political success was limited by Fyodor's reluctance to assert himself in governmental affairs, leaving increasing authority in the hands of his brother-in-law Boris Godunov. Fyodor's path to the throne was dramatically altered in November 1581 when his older brother Ivan Ivanovich died following the fatal confrontation with their father. This tragedy transformed Fyodor from a spare heir into the designated successor to the Russian throne, a role for which he was manifestly unprepared. The death of Ivan Ivanovich created a succession crisis that extended beyond questions of individual capability. With the competent heir gone and only the gentle Fyodor remaining, the boyar nobility began positioning themselves for the power struggles that would inevitably follow Ivan IV's death. Boris Godunov, recognizing his brother-in-law's limitations, began building the alliances that would make him the de facto ruler of Russia. Ivan IV's reaction to his son's death included desperate attempts to prepare Fyodor for the responsibilities of kingship. The Tsar assigned additional tutors and advisors to his surviving heir, but these efforts proved largely unsuccessful. Fyodor's fundamental nature could not be altered through intensive instruction, and his limitations became increasingly apparent as his accession approached. The final years of Ivan IV's reign were marked by the Tsar's growing recognition that his dynasty would likely end with Fyodor. The younger son's apparent inability to produce male heirs, combined with his unsuitability for military leadership, suggested that the Rurikid line would face extinction within a generation. Fyodor ascended to the throne in March 1584 following his father's death. His coronation ceremony in the Cathedral of the Assumption followed ancient precedents, but contemporary observers noted the new Tsar's visible nervousness and apparent uncertainty about his role. Unlike previous Rurikid rulers who had projected confidence and authority, Fyodor seemed diminished by the weight of his responsibilities. From the beginning of his reign, effective power lay with a regency council dominated by Boris Godunov. While Fyodor retained the formal authority of tsar, he showed little interest in the daily business of governance and readily delegated decision-making to his advisors. This arrangement initially provided stability after the chaos of Ivan IV's final years, but it also established precedents that would facilitate the eventual Godunov usurpation. The early years of Fyodor's reign were marked by efforts to repair the damage inflicted by his father's Oprichnina policies. The Regency Council, led by Boris Godunov, implemented reforms designed to restore confidence among the nobility and improve the empire's administrative efficiency. These measures proved largely successful, though credit belonged primarily to Godunov rather than the Tsar himself. Foreign relations during Fyodor's early reign reflected the empire's need for peace and recovery after decades of warfare. The Regency negotiated treaties with Sweden and Poland that ended the costly Livonian War on terms that, while not entirely favorable to Russia, allowed for internal reconstruction and economic recovery. One area where Fyodor showed genuine personal interest and competence was religious affairs. His deep piety and extensive theological knowledge made him an effective advocate for Orthodox interests, both domestically and internationally. The most significant achievement of his reign was the establishment of the Moscow Patriarchate in 1589. The creation of an independent Russian Patriarchate represented a major advancement in Orthodox ecclesiastical organization. Previously, the Russian Church had been subordinate to the Patriarch of Constantinople, a relationship that limited its autonomy and prestige. Fyodor's personal involvement in negotiations with other Orthodox churches helped secure recognition for the new patriarchate. The first patriarch of Moscow, Job, was elevated to his position with Fyodor's strong support. The Tsar attended the installation ceremony and demonstrated detailed knowledge of the theological and canonical issues involved in establishing patriarchal authority. This achievement provided one of the few examples of Fyodor exercising independent leadership during his reign. Religious policies under Fyodor also included efforts to strengthen Orthodox institutions and resist Catholic influence from Poland and Lithuania. The Tsar supported monastery construction, encouraged pilgrimage to holy sites, and maintained the traditional role of the ruler as protector of Orthodox Christianity within his domains. As Fyodor's reign progressed, his dependence on Boris Godunov became increasingly complete. The Tsar showed little aptitude for the complex administrative and military decisions required to govern an empire stretching from the Baltic to the Pacific Ocean. Godunov, demonstrating exceptional competence in these areas, gradually assumed responsibility for virtually all aspects of governance. This arrangement created an unusual form of dual authority in which Fyodor retained the ceremonial and religious functions of tsardom, while Godunov exercised practical power. Foreign ambassadors learned to address their substantive business to Godunov while maintaining the formal protocols required when dealing with the Tsar himself. The administrative reforms implemented during Fyodor's reign reflected Godunov's strategic vision rather than the Tsar's personal initiatives. These included improvements to the military organization, reforms to the tax collection system, and diplomatic initiatives designed to strengthen Russia's position relative to its European neighbors. Godunov's dominance extended to military affairs, where Fyodor showed even less competence than in civilian administration. The Tsar accompanied military campaigns when protocol required his presence, but operational command remained entirely in Godunov's hands. This division of authority proved effective in maintaining military efficiency, while preserving the symbolic importance of royal leadership. The most pressing challenge of Fyodor's reign was the absence of male heirs to continue the Rurikid dynasty. His marriage to Irina Godunova failed to produce surviving children, despite multiple pregnancies that ended in miscarriage or infant death. This reproductive failure created mounting anxiety about the dynasty's future and provided Boris Godunov with additional opportunities to position himself as the inevitable successor. Court physicians and religious authorities explored various explanations for the royal couple's inability to produce heirs. Some contemporary sources suggest that Fyodor's gentle nature extended to a lack of interest in the martial aspects of marriage, though such claims must be evaluated carefully given their politically sensitive nature. The succession crisis became increasingly acute as Fyodor aged without producing children. By the 1590s, it was clear that the Rurikid line would end with his death, unless extraordinary measures were taken. Some advisors suggested that Fyodor divorce Irina and remarry, but the Tsar's religious convictions and personal loyalty to his wife made this option unacceptable. Alternative succession arrangements focused primarily on Boris Godunov, whose marriage to Fyodor's sister and demonstrated administrative competence made him the most logical candidate to assume power. However, Godunov's relatively modest noble origins created legitimacy problems that required careful political management. Despite his personal limitations, Fyodor's reign witnessed significant territorial and diplomatic achievements, though these successes belong primarily to Boris Godunov's strategic leadership rather than the Tsar's personal initiative. The most notable accomplishment was the recovery and expansion of Russian territory in Siberia, building upon the initial conquests made during Ivan IV's reign. The Siberian campaigns during Fyodor's reign established Russian control over vast territories extending to the Pacific Ocean. While the Tsar provided ceremonial approval for these expeditions, the actual planning and execution fell to military commanders operating under Godunov's direction. These conquests added immense territorial wealth to the Russian Empire and established the foundation for future expansion into Asia. Diplomatic relations with European powers improved significantly during Fyodor's reign, partly due to his peaceful nature and partly due to Godunov's skillful negotiations. Treaties with Sweden and Poland stabilized Russia's western borders, while agreements with the Ottoman Empire secured the southern frontiers. These diplomatic achievements provided the stability necessary for internal reconstruction after the devastation of Ivan IV's later years. The establishment of regular diplomatic relations with England and other Western European powers opened new opportunities for trade and cultural exchange. Fyodor's court received foreign ambassadors with appropriate ceremony, though substantive negotiations remained in Godunov's hands. These diplomatic contacts exposed Russia to European administrative practices and military technologies that would prove valuable in future conflicts. Fyodor's reign coincided with a period of economic recovery following the devastation caused by Ivan IV's Oprichnina policies and prolonged warfare. The restoration of agricultural production and commercial activity required careful policy management that Boris Godunov provided through a series of administrative reforms implemented in the Tsar's name. The most significant social policy of Fyodor's reign was the gradual implementation of serfdom restrictions that would eventually bind peasants permanently to the land. While these measures addressed immediate economic needs by stabilizing agricultural labor, they also established the legal foundation for the harsh serfdom system that would characterize Russian society for centuries. Tax reform during this period reflected efforts to rebuild the state's financial resources while avoiding the excessive burdens that had triggered peasant uprisings during Ivan IV's reign. Godunov's administrative experience proved valuable in designing tax systems that generated necessary revenue without provoking widespread resistance. Commercial policies under Fyodor encouraged foreign trade while protecting domestic producers from excessive competition. These measures helped restore confidence among Russian merchants and artisans while generating customs revenue for the imperial treasury. The expansion of trade relations with Western Europe also facilitated the importation of military technologies and luxury goods that enhanced the court's prestige. The aspect of rulership where Fyodor demonstrated genuine personal engagement was religious patronage and monastic foundation. His deep piety expressed itself through generous support for Orthodox institutions and active participation in religious ceremonies throughout his reign. Fyodor personally oversaw the construction and renovation of numerous churches and monasteries across the empire. His involvement extended beyond financial support to include detailed discussions of architectural plans and liturgical arrangements. Contemporary accounts describe the Tsar spending hours consulting with architects and religious authorities about the proper design and decoration of sacred buildings. The Tsar's religious interests also included extensive pilgrimage activities. He regularly visited holy sites throughout his domains, participating in religious festivals and seeking spiritual guidance from respected monks and hermits. These pilgrimages provided some of the few occasions when Fyodor appeared to exercise independent initiative rather than following the guidance of his advisors. His support for religious education included funding for scriptoriums and libraries where religious texts were copied and preserved. Fyodor demonstrated detailed knowledge of Orthodox theology and took personal interest in ensuring the accuracy of religious manuscripts produced under his patronage. The final years of Fyodor's reign were marked by declining health that further limited his already restricted participation in governmental affairs. Contemporary accounts describe symptoms consistent with a chronic wasting disease, possibly tuberculosis, or another respiratory condition common in the medieval period. His illness became particularly pronounced after 1595, when he began experiencing frequent periods of weakness and difficulty breathing. These health problems forced him to delegate even ceremonial duties to Boris Godunov, effectively completing the transfer of authority that had been developing throughout his reign. The Tsar's declining health coincided with mounting anxiety about the succession crisis. With no children to inherit the throne and his own death apparently approaching, Fyodor faced the reality that his passing would mark the end of the Rurikid dynasty that had ruled Russia for over 7 centuries. Despite his physical weakness, Fyodor maintained his religious observances until the very end of his life. He continued attending liturgical services when his health permitted and spent increasing amounts of time in prayer and religious contemplation as his condition deteriorated. Fyodor first died on January 7, 1598, at the age of 40. His death was peaceful, occurring in the presence of his wife Irina and religious advisors who had provided spiritual comfort during his final illness. Contemporary accounts describe his last days as marked by resignation and religious preparation for death rather than anxiety about earthly concerns. The Tsar's death immediately triggered the succession crisis that had been anticipated throughout his reign. With no direct heirs and no clear constitutional mechanism for selecting a new ruler, Russia faced its first dynastic transition since the establishment of the Rurikid line in the 9th century. Fyodor was buried in the Cathedral of the Archangel with full honors befitting the last Rurikid tsar. His tomb was marked with inscriptions praising his piety and peaceful nature, though these epitaphs could not disguise the historical reality that his reign had marked the end of an era in Russian history. The immediate aftermath of his death saw a brief attempt by his widow Irina to claim regental authority, but she quickly abdicated in favor of monastic life. This decision cleared the path for Boris Godunov's formal election as Tsar, though his reign would prove troubled and brief. Fyodor's reign presents historians with the challenge of evaluating a ruler whose personal limitations were compensated by exceptionally capable advisors. While he lacked the intellectual and political skills traditionally associated with effective leadership, his gentle nature and religious devotion provided moral authority that legitimized the administrative reforms implemented during his reign. The peaceful character of his rule offered a stark contrast to the violence and chaos of his father's later years. Under Fyodor's nominal authority, Russia experienced a period of recovery and consolidation that prepared the empire for the challenges of the 17th century, even though this stability would prove temporary. His failure to produce heirs marked the end of the Rurikid dynasty, but this reproductive failure reflected medical realities beyond his personal control rather than deliberate neglect of dynastic responsibilities. The succession crisis that followed his death would ultimately lead to the time of troubles, but the immediate causes of that instability lay in the structural problems of Russian governance rather than Fyodor's personal failings. The religious achievements of his reign, particularly the establishment of the Moscow Patriarchate, provided lasting benefits for Russian Orthodoxy and enhanced the empire's prestige within the broader Orthodox world. These accomplishments reflected areas where Fyodor's personal interests and capabilities aligned with the needs of his realm. In 1896, nearly 3 centuries after his death, Fyodor I was canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church as a saint. This recognition reflected the Church's appreciation for his religious devotion and peaceful character rather than any assessment of his political achievements. The canonization emphasized Fyodor's role as a pious ruler who governed with humility and Christian charity. Church authorities particularly praised his support for religious institutions and his personal example of Orthodox devotion throughout his reign. This saintly recognition also served political purposes for the Romanov dynasty, which sought to demonstrate continuity with earlier Russian rulers while distinguishing their own legitimacy from the troubled period that followed Fyodor's death. The canonization reinforced the idea that peaceful religious leadership represented an authentic Russian tradition. The cult of Saint Fyodor developed slowly but steadily within Russian Orthodox communities. His feast day became an occasion for prayers seeking peaceful resolution of conflicts and divine blessing for rulers facing difficult decisions. This religious memory preserved aspects of his legacy that secular historical assessment might overlook. In 1561, following the death of his beloved first wife Anastasia in 1560, Ivan IV shocked the Russian court by announcing his intention to marry a foreign princess. His choice fell upon Maria Temryukovna, daughter of a Circassian prince from the North Caucasus region. This marriage represented a dramatic departure from Russian tradition and reflected Ivan's growing alienation from the boyar nobility that had dominated his first reign. The Circassian alliance served multiple political purposes for Ivan IV. It provided a connection to the Muslim peoples of the Caucasus region, potentially strengthening Russian influence in the strategically important area between the Black and Caspian Seas. The marriage also demonstrated Ivan's independence from boyar influence, as the traditional nobility had played no role in arranging this union. Maria Temryukovna's arrival at the Russian court in 1561 created considerable tension among the established noble families. Unlike Anastasia, who had come from the respected Romanov clan, the new Tsarina was viewed as an outsider whose foreign customs and Orthodox conversion appeared incomplete to traditionalist observers. The marriage ceremony, conducted in the Cathedral of the Assumption, followed Orthodox rites but included elements that reflected the bride's exotic origins. Contemporary accounts describe elaborate costumes and jewelry that differed markedly from traditional Russian royal wedding attire, emphasizing the foreign character of this alliance. In 1563, Maria Temryukovna gave birth to a son who was named Vasily in honor of Ivan's grandfather, Vasily III. The birth of this prince represented hope for dynastic continuation at a time when Ivan had only 3 surviving children from his first marriage: Ivan Ivanovich, Fyodor, and the young Eudoxia. Vasily Ivanovich's birth occurred during a period of mounting political tension in the Russian court. Ivan IV was beginning to develop the paranoid tendencies that would culminate in the Oprichnina period, while his relationship with traditional advisors like Adashev and Sylvester was deteriorating rapidly. The infant prince was placed under the care of wet nurses and tutors selected partly from his mother's Circassian retinue and partly from established Russian noble families. This mixed arrangement reflected Ivan's attempt to balance integration of his foreign queen with accommodation of traditional Russian practices. Contemporary accounts suggest that Vasily was a healthy infant who showed normal development during his first months of life. Court physicians monitored his progress carefully, particularly given the high rate of infant mortality that had already claimed several of Ivan's children. The upbringing of Vasily Ivanovich took place within the complex cultural environment created by his mother's foreign origins. Maria Temryukovna had converted to Orthodox Christianity upon her marriage to Ivan, but she retained many Circassian customs and maintained connections with her family's traditional culture. This cultural duality created unique challenges for the infant prince's education and formation. Orthodox priests insisted on traditional religious instruction, while his mother's influence introduced elements of Circassian warrior culture that differed significantly from established Russian noble traditions. The court's reaction to these cultural influences reflected broader tensions about the role of foreign elements in Russian society. Conservative boyars viewed any deviation from traditional practices with suspicion, while Ivan IV seemed to welcome innovations that distinguished his reign from those of his predecessors. Religious instruction for the young prince followed Orthodox requirements, but contemporary sources suggest that Maria Temryukovna's incomplete assimilation to Russian Christianity created confusion about proper ceremonial observances and theological education. Vasily Ivanovich's birth strengthened the political alliance between Russia and the Circassian princes, providing Ivan IV with potential allies in his expanding conflicts with the Ottoman Empire and the Crimean Khanate. The infant's existence served as a living symbol of this diplomatic relationship. The Circassian connection also influenced Ivan's military strategies in the Caucasus region. Russian expansion into this area during the 1560s reflected partly the Tsar's desire to support his wife's family and partly his broader ambitions to control the routes between Europe and Asia. However, the foreign character of this alliance created domestic political problems for Ivan. Many boyars viewed the Circassian marriage as evidence of the Tsar's rejection of traditional Russian values and his dangerous tendency toward exotic innovations. The infant prince's potential role in future succession arrangements remained unclear during his brief life. While he represented a male heir to supplement Ivan Ivanovich and Fyodor, his mixed heritage raised questions about his suitability for the throne in the eyes of traditionalist nobles. Vasily Ivanovich died in 1563, still an infant of less than 1 year. The exact cause of his death is not recorded in surviving historical documents, but it occurred during the same period when epidemic diseases were claiming lives throughout Moscow and the surrounding regions. The prince's death removed a potential complicating factor from the succession arrangements while simultaneously weakening the political alliance with the Circassian princes. His brief life had served primarily symbolic purposes, representing Ivan's independence from boyar influence rather than establishing substantive dynastic alternatives. The loss of her only child appears to have affected Maria Temryukovna's position at court significantly. Without a living son to anchor her political importance, the Circassian Tsarina became increasingly marginalized within the complex hierarchy of the Russian court. Contemporary accounts suggest that Vasily's death contributed to the growing strain in Ivan's relationship with his second wife. The Tsar's expectations for male heirs from this marriage had been disappointed, while Maria's foreign origins continued to create tension with traditional noble families. Vasily Ivanovich was buried in the Cathedral of the Archangel alongside his half-siblings from Ivan's first marriage. His tomb was marked with a simple inscription identifying him as a son of Ivan IV, though it made no reference to his Circassian maternal heritage. The burial ceremony followed standard Orthodox rites for royal children, but contemporary observers noted the absence of the elaborate mourning rituals that had marked the deaths of children from Ivan's first marriage. This difference reflected the court's ambivalent attitude toward the Circassian connection. Historical memory of Vasily Ivanovich remained minimal due to his brief life and the controversial nature of his parents' marriage. Unlike his half-brothers, who would achieve historical significance through their adult lives and political roles, Vasily left no lasting impact on Russian history beyond his symbolic importance as evidence of Ivan's matrimonial independence. The prince's death also marked the beginning of the end for Maria Temryukovna's influence at court. She would die in 1569, possibly by poisoning, bringing to a close the brief experiment in Circassian-Russian royal alliance that had produced this short-lived heir. While Vasily Ivanovich's life was too brief to establish independent historical significance, his birth and death illuminate important aspects of Ivan IV's reign and character. The Circassian marriage that produced him reflected Ivan's growing alienation from traditional Russian institutions and his willingness to shock conservative opinion. The infant's existence also demonstrates the continuing pressure on Ivan to produce multiple male heirs as insurance against the high rates of royal infant mortality. Each birth represented hope for dynastic security, while each death reinforced the vulnerability of even the most powerful families to medical realities beyond their control. His mixed heritage would have created interesting succession questions had he survived to adulthood. The integration of Circassian noble traditions with Russian imperial practices might have produced innovations in government and military organization, though such speculation remains purely hypothetical. The brief life of Vasily Ivanovich thus serves primarily as a footnote to the larger story of Ivan IV's family tragedies and political evolution. His death removed one potential complication from the succession while contributing to the atmosphere of loss and instability that characterized the Tsar's later years. In October 1582, Ivan IV's seventh wife, Maria Nagaya, gave birth to a son who would be named Dmitry. This birth occurred during the final period of Ivan's reign, when the Tsar was 62 years old and increasingly isolated from the boyar nobility that had traditionally supported the Russian monarchy. The child's arrival represented both hope for dynastic continuation and a source of potential succession conflict. The marriage to Maria Nagaya itself was controversial within the context of Orthodox canon law, which traditionally limited marriages to 3 per lifetime. Ivan's seventh marriage violated ecclesiastical rules and was never fully recognized by church authorities, casting doubt on the legitimacy of any children born from this union. Dmitry's birth took place in the Kremlin palace, but the circumstances differed markedly from those surrounding the births of Ivan's earlier children. The court was smaller, more isolated, and dominated by the paranoid atmosphere that characterized Ivan's final years. Many traditional noble families had been eliminated during the Oprichnina persecutions, leaving a power vacuum that would complicate the infant's future. The naming of the child, as Dmitry recalled Ivan's first son who had died in infancy 30 years earlier. This choice reflected either hope for better fortune or the Tsar's increasingly confused mental state, as he struggled with the accumulated tragedies of his reign and the approaching end of his dynasty. Dmitry's early years unfolded against the backdrop of mounting succession anxiety within the Russian court. Ivan Ivanovich had died in 1581, leaving only Fyodor as the clear, legitimate heir to the throne. Fyodor's obvious limitations as a ruler created uncertainty about the dynasty's future, making Dmitry's existence politically significant despite questions about his legitimacy. The infant was placed under the care of his mother's family, the Nogoys, who were relatively recent arrivals at court without the established connections enjoyed by older noble families. This arrangement reflected Ivan IV's distrust of traditional boyar families rather than confidence in the Nogoys' capabilities as guardians of a potential heir. Boris Godunov, already emerging as the dominant figure in court politics through his relationship with Fyodor, viewed Dmitry's existence with suspicion and concern. A legitimate male heir, even one of questionable canonical status, could complicate Godunov's plans for maintaining power after Ivan IV's death. The political tensions surrounding Dmitry became more pronounced as Ivan IV's health declined. The Tsar's increasing physical weakness and mental instability created a power vacuum that various court factions sought to fill, with Dmitry's supporters representing one potential alternative to Godunov's dominance. When Ivan IV died in March 1584, the succession proceeded according to established precedent, with Fyodor ascending to the throne without immediate challenge. However, Dmitri's existence created an underlying tension that would persist throughout Fyodor's reign, as the younger prince represented a potential alternative should circumstances change. The immediate aftermath of Ivan's death saw careful political maneuvering around Dmitri's status. Boris Godunov, recognizing the potential threat posed by any alternative claimant, arranged for the infant prince and his mother to be sent to Uglish, a provincial town that would serve as their place of exile disguised as an appanage principality. Uglich, located on the Volga River northeast of Moscow, provided a suitable location for maintaining Dmitri under surveillance while removing him from direct involvement in court politics. The town's remote location and limited political significance made it an ideal place to contain potential opposition to Godunov's growing authority. The arrangement was presented as a traditional appanage grant, giving Dmitri nominal authority over Uglish and its surrounding territories. This fiction maintained the appearance of respect for his royal status while effectively neutralizing any immediate political threat he might represent. Dmitri's childhood in Uglich unfolded in an environment that combined royal ceremony with political isolation. He was raised with the dignity appropriate to his birth, receiving education in Orthodox theology and basic literacy, but his daily life was carefully monitored by agents loyal to Boris Godunov. The court established at Uglish included members of the Nagoy family and a small retinue of servants and tutors. This household maintained the ceremonial aspects of royal life while lacking the political significance and military resources that would be necessary for any serious challenge to the established government in Moscow. Contemporary accounts describe Dmitri as an intelligent and energetic child who showed interest in military games and displayed the physical courage expected of a potential ruler. These qualities, while admirable in themselves, increased Godunov's anxiety about the young prince's potential to attract supporters as he matured. The educational program provided for Dmitri included instruction in Church Slavonic, basic mathematics, and Orthodox theology. However, his isolation from the main centers of learning and political activity limited his exposure to the broader knowledge and skills that would be necessary for effective rule. As Dmitri approached adolescence, his mere existence became increasingly problematic for Boris Godunov's long-term political plans. Fyodor's failure to produce heirs meant that the succession question would eventually become critical, and Dmitri represented the most obvious alternative to Godunov family claims to power. The political situation was complicated by Fyodor's declining health and the growing recognition that he would likely die without children. This reality focused attention on potential succession arrangements and made Dmitri's status a matter of urgent political concern rather than theoretical speculation. Intelligence reports reaching Moscow suggested that Dmitri was developing into a capable and charismatic young man who might prove attractive to noble families dissatisfied with Godunov's dominance. These reports, whether accurate or exaggerated, increased pressure for a permanent solution to the succession problem. The Nagoy family's attempts to maintain connections with potential supporters in Moscow created additional anxiety for Godunov. While these efforts remained largely unsuccessful, they demonstrated the continuing political relevance of Dmitri's bloodline and the potential for future challenges to established authority. On May 15, 1591, 90-year-old Dmitri died in Uglish under circumstances that immediately generated suspicion and controversy. The official investigation, conducted by representatives sent from Moscow, concluded that the prince had accidentally stabbed himself during an epileptic seizure while playing with a knife. This explanation satisfied few contemporaries and has been questioned by historians ever since. The coincidental timing of Dmitri's death, occurring when he was approaching an age when he could begin asserting political claims, suggested deliberate assassination rather than accidental death. The investigation was led by Vasily Shuisky, a boyar with close ties to Boris Godunov, raising questions about its objectivity and thoroughness. Contemporary accounts describe widespread skepticism about the official findings, both among the population of Uglish and in broader Russian society. The immediate aftermath of Dmitri's death included riots in Uglish, where local residents attacked officials they blamed for the prince's demise. These disturbances were suppressed by military force, and many participants were executed or exiled, effectively silencing potential witnesses to the events surrounding the death. The official investigation concluded that Dimitri's death resulted from an accident during an epileptic seizure, a medical condition that had not been previously documented in historical records concerning the prince. This sudden revelation of epilepsy appeared convenient for those seeking to explain away suspicions of murder. Witnesses to the events surrounding Dimitri's death provided conflicting accounts that the investigation failed to reconcile satisfactorily. Some testified to seeing the prince playing peacefully before his sudden collapse, while others described signs of struggle or the presence of unfamiliar individuals in the area. The speed with which the investigation was concluded and its findings announced suggested a predetermined outcome rather than a thorough examination of evidence. The destruction of physical evidence and the execution of potential witnesses further compromised the credibility of the official conclusions. Maria Nagaya, Dimitri's mother, was forced to take monastic vows immediately after her son's death, effectively silencing the person most likely to challenge the official explanation. Her confinement to a remote convent eliminated any possibility of her providing alternative testimony about the circumstance of the death. The death of Dimitri created immediate religious and political complications that would persist for decades. Popular belief in his innocence and sanctity began developing almost immediately, laying the foundation for his eventual canonization as a martyr and saint. Local religious authorities in Uglitch began treating Dimitri's grave as a shrine, reporting miraculous healings and other supernatural events connected to his remains. These developments occurred despite official discouragement and suggested widespread popular rejection of the government's explanation for his death. The political implications of Dimitri's death extended beyond immediate succession questions to encompass broader issues of governmental legitimacy and divine justice. Popular belief that the prince had been murdered for political reasons undermined confidence in Boris Godunov's administration and prepared the ground for future challenges to his authority. The emergence of pretenders claiming to be the resurrected Dimitri would begin within a decade of his death, indicating the lasting political significance of his martyrdom. These false Dimitris would play crucial roles in the time of troubles that followed Fyodor's death, demonstrating the failure of assassination to resolve the succession crisis. In 1606, 15 years after his death, Dimitri was canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church as a martyr and saint. This recognition reflected both popular devotion to his memory and political calculations by rulers seeking to legitimize their authority through association with the martyred prince. The canonization ceremony included the formal translation of Dimitri's remains from Uglitch to the Cathedral of the Archangel in Moscow, where he was interred alongside other members of the Rurikid dynasty. This elevation served to officially acknowledge his royal status while providing religious sanction for popular beliefs about his innocence. The development of Saint Dimitri's cult included the composition of liturgical texts celebrating his martyrdom and the establishment of his feast day in the Orthodox calendar. These religious observances provided outlets for popular grief and anger while channeling political dissent into acceptable religious forms. Pilgrimage to Dimitri's shrine became popular among Russians seeking divine intervention in personal and political matters. The saint's reputation for protecting children and defending the innocent against injustice made him particularly attractive to ordinary believers facing oppression or tragedy. The death of Dimitri of Uglitch served as a catalyst for the political crisis known as the Time of Troubles that engulfed Russia from 1598 to 1613. His martyrdom provided symbolic justification for opposition to the Godunov dynasty and legitimized the various pretenders who claimed his identity. The first false Dimitri appeared in Poland around 1603, claiming to be the miraculously preserved Prince of Uglitch. This pretender's invasion of Russia and temporary seizure of the throne demonstrated the lasting political power of Dimitri's memory and the failure of his assassination to resolve succession questions. Subsequent false Dimitris continued to appear throughout the Time of Troubles, each drawing support from populations that believed in the original prince's innocence and sanctity. These movements reflected deeper problems in Russian political culture but used Dimitri's martyrdom as their primary source of legitimacy. The eventual resolution of the Time of Troubles with the election of Michael Romanov as Tsar in 1613 did not diminish Dimitri's religious significance. The new dynasty cultivated his memory as a symbol of divine justice and legitimate monarchy. demonstrating the complex relationship between political power and religious authority in Russian culture. The story of Dmitry of Uglish thus represents more than a simple tale of royal infant mortality or political assassination. His brief life and controversial death illuminate the fragility of political legitimacy in early modern Russia and the power of religious belief to shape historical narratives and political outcomes. Within the walls of the Moscow Kremlin stands the Cathedral of the Archangel, the final resting place of the Rurikid dynasty. Here, in tombs of stone and bronze, lie the remains of Ivan the Terrible's children, silent witnesses to the end of a bloodline that had ruled Russia for over 7 centuries. Anna Ivanovna and Maria Ivanovna rest in unmarked graves, their brief lives remembered only in the chronicles that recorded their births and deaths. Beside them lies the first Dmitry, the infant Tsarevich, whose death during a pilgrimage marked the beginning of Ivan's dynastic anxieties. Their tombs speak to the medical realities of 16th century Russia, where even imperial blood offered no protection against epidemic disease and infant mortality. The tomb of Ivan Ivanovich bears more elaborate inscriptions, befitting the heir who lived to manhood and demonstrated the capabilities that might have preserved the dynasty. His monument serves as a memorial not only to his individual tragedy, but to the larger failure of the Rurikid line to successfully transfer power to a new generation. Fyodor I lies beneath the most ornate monument, his tomb reflecting his status as the last legitimate Rurikid tsar. The inscriptions praise his piety and peaceful nature while carefully avoiding mention of his childlessness and the succession crisis that followed his death. Dmitry of Uglish occupies a place of honor among these royal graves, his status as martyr and saint elevating him above his siblings in religious, if not political, significance. Pilgrims still visit his shrine, Sirtson, seeking intercession from the boy prince whose controversial death sparked decades of political chaos. With Fyodor's death on January 7, 1598, the male line of the Rurikid dynasty came to an end after ruling Russia since the 9th century. The failure of Ivan's 8 children to produce surviving male heirs marked one of history's most complete dynastic extinctions, leaving a power vacuum that would convulse Russia for 15 years. The immediate succession fell to Boris Godunov, who had already been governing in Fyodor's name for over a decade. But Godunov's relatively modest noble origins and the suspicious circumstances surrounding Dmitry of Uglish's death undermined his legitimacy from the beginning. The time of troubles that followed, featuring false pretenders, foreign invasion, social revolution, and near-complete governmental collapse, demonstrated the importance of legitimate dynastic succession in maintaining political stability. The chaos ended only with the election of Michael Romanov in 1613, establishing a new dynasty that would rule Russia until 1917. Ironically, the dynasty that replaced the Rurikids traced its legitimacy partly through Ivan the Terrible's first wife, Anastasia Romanovna. The Romanov family's blood connection to Ivan's children provided a thread of continuity that helped legitimize their rule and satisfy popular expectations about royal bloodlines. This genealogical connection meant that while the direct male line of Ivan's descendants had vanished, their genetic heritage continued through the female line into the new dynasty. The Romanovs carefully cultivated this connection, presenting themselves as the natural heirs to the Rurikid tradition, rather than usurpers of a vacant throne. 3 of Ivan's children, Fyodor I, Dmitry of Uglish, and eventually Ivan Ivanovich, would be canonized by the Russian Orthodox Church, transforming them from historical figures into objects of religious veneration. These canonizations reflected both genuine popular devotion and political calculations by later rulers seeking divine sanction for their authority. The religious memory of Ivan's children emphasized their innocence, piety, and suffering rather than their political failures or dynastic extinction. This spiritual interpretation provided a form of immortality that transcended their biological deaths and childlessness. The story of Ivan the Terrible's children illuminates the vulnerability of even the most powerful dynasties to the biological realities of human mortality. Despite wealth, medical care, and political importance, 7 of Ivan's 8 children died without producing heirs, creating the succession crisis that ended Rurikid rule. Their collective fate also reflects the destructive effects of Ivan's own policies and personality on his family relationships. The atmosphere of violence, paranoia, and political instability that characterized his later reign contributed to the deaths of at least 2 of his children and undermined the dynasty's long-term stability. Yet their story transcends simple tragedy to illuminate broader themes in Russian history: the relationship between political legitimacy and religious authority, the role of popular belief in shaping historical narratives, and the complex process by which medieval dynasties gave way to early modern state systems. The children of Ivan the Terrible thus serve as more than footnotes to their father's reign. Their births, lives, and deaths shaped the political development of Russia and influenced the course of events long after the last Rurikid had been laid to rest in the Cathedral of the Archangel. In the end, the dynasty that had survived Mongol invasion, boyar rebellion, and foreign war succumbed to the simple biological failure to produce surviving heirs. The Rurikid line, which had seemed eternal in its power and longevity, proved as mortal as the children who carried its blood. And with their deaths, an age of Russian history came to its close.